Hello, I'm Jack, and welcome to the third video in a series where I'll show you novice DIYs how you can build your own fitted wardrobe. In this video, we're going to focus on making and fitting your doors, which can really make the difference between your wardrobe looking like a professional job versus a botch. I'm going to start by showing you how to assemble the door, and then how to add the hinges and fit the door to your wardrobe frame. The technique that I'm going to show you is the simplest way that you can build your own shaker style doors. It's sometimes called the faker shaker method, because while it's got a very similar look to a traditional shaker style door, it's built in a different way to the standard approach of using things like mortise and tenons or loose tenons. So let's start with an overview of the different components of a faker shaker door. The starting point is a 12mm thick MDF backer panel, which needs to be the size of the door's height and width. You then stick 6mm thick stiles vertically all the way up both sides of the door. The final step is to cut 6mm thick rails to length using a miter saw. I'm using 3 for this door, but you can use 2 if your doors are smaller, or you may want to use more if your doors are taller, or you just like that style. You'll find that pretty quickly you've got yourself a handsome shaker door. I'm going to share the steps to follow in a bit more detail now, but I should say that the order might not make sense at first, but bear with me because it will do soon. Your first job is to cut your stiles to length. This should be really easy assuming that you follow the steps in the first video, because they should already be cut to width, so it's just a case of cutting them to the same height as your door. The second stage is to use a chamfer bit in a router, or a piece of sandpaper by hand, to take off your inside front edge of the stile. The reason you do this now and not later is because it won't be very easy to access once you've glued it onto the door. You could just leave those edges as they are, but they're quite sharp and really won't take paint very well, so I wouldn't recommend it. If you're lucky enough to have a router, you can either clamp the MDF down and slide the router along the edge, or as I have here, bolt the router up into some scrap and run the stiles through. If you've decided not to treat yourself to a router, you can get good results by rubbing some 120 grit sandpaper up and down the edge several times. As you can see, it's really difficult to tell the chamfered rail from one that's been hand sanded. Just make sure that you sand each section the same amount so the chamfer is even all around. It's important that at this stage, you just do this to the inside front edge of the stile, which is the red line on the image you can see. Just to be clear, in these videos I'm working on the rails and not the stiles, but the concept is exactly the same for both. The third stage is to stick your stiles down onto your backer panel, and it's really crucial that you find a perfectly flat surface for this stage, otherwise you'll find that when your glue cures, your door may curve to the shape of the surface. Mark the position of where the hinges are going to go onto the stile, so that you know when you come to nail the stile down you don't do it in a position where you're going to drill with the hinge. I use 4 hinges for full height doors, with the bottom and top hinges 10 cm from the end of the door and the other 2 hinges spaced evenly between them. Make sure that you hoover away any dust and then squeeze your wood glue on. I found that cheap paint rollers are great for spreading it equally. Be careful to position the stile so that its top, bottom and outer edge are perfectly flush with the backer panel edge. I used a nail gun at this point to pin the stile in place, being careful to avoid the hinge areas. But you can do just as good a job with a hammer and some 15mm panel pins, which is actually how I made my first faker shaker door. Throughout this process, keep checking that the stile remains in place while hammering the pin home, and use a nail punch to tap it just below the surface. You'll fill these holes at a later stage. Do the same for your other stile and then you're onto rails. Stage 4 is really simple. It's just a case of measuring your gaps between your stiles and cutting your rails to size with a miter saw. You're much better off cutting your rails slightly oversized and shaving a tiny bit off if you need to. Once you've cut them, remember to label them, otherwise you'll lose track of what's what. We're on to stage 5, and before you glue your rails down, you need to make sure that you run your router with a chamfer bit over the front 4 edges of the rail, or use some sandpaper. To make it really clear, I've highlighted the edges that you'll need to do this on here. Your rails are now ready, so in stage 6 you'll glue them down, making sure that they're positioned perfectly flush with the top and bottom of the door. For your middle rail, you want to make sure that it's positioned absolutely centrally in the door, providing that's the design that you've gone for. Stage 7 is another one that's probably optional, but for the best finish I'd really recommend doing it. It's about adding filler to the edges of the door to give you the crispest finish you can get. I didn't used to do this stage, but now I've tried it, I definitely won't go back, because it gives you a much smoother and professional paint finish on your MDF edge. I use a filling knife to slap some bog standard wood filler on. You can just about see that there are 3 doors stacked on top of each here, which makes this job much quicker. I first saw this technique being used by Ryan at the London Craftsman, who's got a few really good videos on getting the best out of MDF. Once the fill is dried, you can sand it down with some fine grit sandpaper, something like 240, either by power sander or by hand. It only needs a tickle and you'll have super smooth door edges that will paint so much better. Stage 8 is the final step. With your filler now on your door edges, you can go all the way around the front and back of your door, chamfering the edges or using sandpaper if you're using that method instead. You can see here how much quicker this is with a router, and that's why I said in the first video in this series that it's really worth treating yourself to one. You can get a decent one for under 100 quid. I give the corners of the door a quick swipe with the sandpaper to round them over slightly. The last step before moving on to hinges is to fill the nail holes, which I do by hand, and then sand. And that's it. Your doors are now complete and you're ready to move on to hinges. Hinges can actually be really quite confusing, but I'll do my best to keep it simple. The large majority of modern kitchen and wardrobe units are now fitted with what's called concealed hinges, sometimes called Euro hinges. There's a few reasons for their popularity, including the fact that they're adjustable and that they're positioned at the back of the door so you can't see them from the front. The adjustability is a massive selling point, especially for less experienced DIYs, as it allows a few millimetres of forgiveness. Different brands of concealed hinges work slightly differently, but generally there are 3 grub screws, which allow you to tweak the door position up and down, side to side, and forwards and backwards. They come in 2 different parts. You've got the mounting plate, which is screwed into the framework of the door, and then you've got the hinge itself, which is screwed into the back of the door. You can see here how the hinge clips onto the mounting plate. There are 2 main types of concealed hinge. You've got inset and overlay. I'm going to show you the approach that I took for my wardrobe, which involved using a combination of both. Your situation might be slightly different, so please do make sure that you do your research. Inset hinges have a bend in them, which allows the back edge of the door to be inset against the cabinet, or framework in this case. Overlay hinges are straight and designed so that the door sits in front of the framework. This bird's eye view diagram shows how I used inset hinges for the left hand side of this build, which was mirrored for the far right hand side. I set the mounting plate further forward onto the frame so that the front of the door sits flush with the side profile. The 4 other doors either had their own upright or shared one like in this diagram. The studs that the framework is made out of are 38mm wide, so the doors overlaid the studs by 17 to 18mm each, leaving a 3mm gap between the doors, which is also called the reveal. 3mm is a good door reveal to aim for, because it's smart enough to look good without being so precise that it'll show up any tiny errors. For this wardrobe, I used a new brand of hinges that I've not used before, called GTV. They worked really well and are much more affordable than brands I've used before, so I'll post a link below so you can have a look for yourself. While concealed hinges are adjustable, there's only so much you can tweak them, so I definitely recommend doing a test fit on a bit of scrap material to make sure you've got your calculations right before you butcher your door and framework. Imagine this piece of MDF is the back of one of your doors. I measure and mark the position of the hinge centre versus the edge of the door, which affects how far left and right the door is positioned versus the framework. All hinges have separate instructions for drilling positions, so be sure to refer to those. I use a brad awl to mark the exact spot, and then drill a 35mm hole with a Forstner bit attached to my combi drill. I keep testing to see if the hinge sits fully in the hole, and make sure that you don't drill too deep and come out the other side of the door. I then use a square to make sure that the hinge is at 90 degrees to the door edge and drill a small pilot hole. Here I drilled the first hole with a self-centering drill bit, which are great little gadgets, but you can just as easily drill a hole with a normal bit. Just make sure that it's dead centre. Fix your screws in place by hand, making sure that you don't over tighten, and you can then move on to the mounting plates. Mark the position of the mounting plates onto a piece of scrap stud work. I'm using a jig here to mark where to drill for screws, but you can just as easily measure them. How far back you fix the mounting plates affects how close or far from the framework the door is. Drill 5mm holes and screw the mounting plates in place. You can then clip the hinges onto the mounting plates and have a play around to see if you're happy with your practice run. You're aiming for the practice door to open and close well, and for the distance between the door edge and the frame to be as planned. If there's anything you're not happy about, do another practice run and keep going until you are happy, because this is the stage to make mistakes at. Once you're happy with the outcome of your test fit, you can move on to the real thing, which is exactly the same process but just on a bigger scale. Here's a time lapse of the full process on one of the wardrobe doors. Back at the customer's house, to help quickly mark the mounting plate positions onto the framework, I set up a laser level and drew a line where the bottom mounting plate needs to be fitted. I then repeat the same stages as with the practice run. Initially I fit just the bottom mounting plate, then clip the door on. This allows me to mark exactly where the second hinge down is positioned onto the frame. I fit the mounting plate for that second hinge, then put the door back on again, marking the 2 remaining mounting plate positions. Of course, you could just measure the gaps between the hinges and transfer these to the framework, but I find this method reduces the chance of being out by a few millimeters. Soon enough, your first door will be on, and it's a really great feeling. I should mention that it's not always that easy to clip on all the hinges in one go by yourself while you're supporting the weight of the door, so if you have got the option of a helper for this stage, it might be worth calling on them. To give you an idea of how the hinge adjustment can help, here you can see a bigger gap at the top of the door than the bottom. To reduce the gap at the top, I tweak the sideways adjustment screws on the top and second to top hinges. You can see how this instantly reduces the gap, and while you might not get it right first time, you can tweak until your heart's content. I'm not going to talk you through how I made the angled doors, firstly because I wouldn't recommend attempting them as your first DIY wardrobe, and secondly, if I'm being totally honest, my approach involved a lot of trial and error. Eventually I'll have all your doors on with consistent gaps of 3mm between them. The last stage is to align the height of the doors. You shouldn't have much or any tweaking to do if you've been careful with the mounting plate position, but to get it spot on, you can lay a spirit level across the top of the doors and tweak them up and down until the spirit level lies flat. Don't worry about the gaps that you can see between the top of the doors and the ceiling, these will get sorted in the final video. There's no doubt that the doors are the trickiest part of your wardrobe build. They need to look great and function well, so don't be too hard on yourself if things don't go to plan. Fortunately with MDF you're working with a really affordable material, so the worst case scenario is that you lose an hour or two and you've got to buy a bit more MDF. It really isn't the end of the world. So by this point I'd say that you're well over 3/4 of the way to building your own fitted wardrobe. The last video is going to cover all the finishing touches that will make sure that your wardrobe looks just as good as it would if you were spending a few grand on it.